All right, guys, we're going to look at 4 examples of how we can tell what the equation of a sine graph is. Right here, we have just y equals sine x. How do we know this is y equals sine x? Let's just look at some of the visual clues here. Okay, so we have our first little cycle demonstrated here. Starts at 0, 0, ends at 2 pi. The highest point is 1, lowest point is -1. Right? It looks just like, it's positive between 0 and pi. It's negative between 0 and pi and 2 pi. Okay, so nothing's happened to it. It hasn't had its amplitude or its vertical shift impacted at all. So let's look at example 1. How would we write the equation for this graph? Okay, so all of our equations are going to be in the form of y equals a sine x plus c, right? And we need to figure out what a and c are, right? Remember that a is the amplitude and c is our vertical shift or our vertical displacement. In this particular one, it doesn't look like it's been shifted at all, right? It hasn't been moved up or down. The midline is still the x-axis. So c is 0. So all we need to do is figure out what the amplitude is. And the amplitude is this distance from here to here or from here to here. So the amplitude appears to be 2. So a is 2. So let's look at the equation. Y equals 2 sine x. All we have to do is replace a with 2, and we have it. Okay, so that's example 1. All right, let's look at example 2. Same thing. A is going to be our amplitude. C is going to represent our vertical shift. But now we have to look at this. It's a sine graph, right? And it starts at 0, 0. But since it goes down first instead of up, it's the reflection, right? It's been reflected. So we know this is a negative sine graph. We can also tell the amplitude is 2. The midline's still at 0, so our c value is just going to be 0, right? So let's look at the equation for this guy, right? Our a is -2. It's negative because it's a negative sine graph, and it's 2 because this distance is 2, this distance is 2. So your goal is going to be able to look at a graph and decide all of these things on your own. These are the thoughts that you need to have. Is it a sine graph, a cosine graph? Is it positive? Is it negative? What's the c value? What's the a value, etc.? All right, let's look at example 3. Okay, so this one looks a little different. Okay, let's also confirm that it is indeed a sine graph. Right? It's a sine graph, although it doesn't start at 0, 0. It does start at like the midline. So if we were going to figure out, I find when I'm looking for this, I can tell this guy got shifted up. How can I tell it got shifted up? The x-axis is not in the middle of the graph, right? When it's not shifted, the x-axis should be in the middle. Well, the x-axis is a little bit below the middle, so this guy had to have gotten shifted up. Where does the middle appear to be? So we have a couple ways we can do it. We can just visually say, like, where's the middle look like it is? Well, it looks like it's around here, right? That looks like it's the middle. How can we verify for sure? Well, our minimum is at -2, and our maximum is at +4. What's in the middle between -2 and +4? Okay, so the way I like to do that is I just like to see, okay, well, -2, +4, what's the average of those two? So -2 and +4, add them together, you get 2, divided by 2, you get 1. So the average between -2 and +4 is 1, and we can see visually that the midline is 1. So since 1 is the middle, that means our c value is going to be 1. All right, now that we know that c value is 1, we got to figure out how far up do we go or how far down do we go from that 1. So since the highest point is at 4 and the lowest point is at -2 on the y-axis, then our a value is going to be 3, right? Because this distance is 3 from the midline up, from the midline down, The distance is also 3. Right? Now we have to make sure, is it a positive sine graph or a negative sine graph? It's a positive sine graph. It goes up first. Okay? So in this case, I found C first, and then I used C to help me find A. And that's generally how I like to do it, but it's not the only way it can be done. All right, so let's look at the equation. See that our A value was 3 and our C value was 1. And you see how we found that, like we looked where the middle is. So even though it didn't start at 0, 0, it started at the midline. So if your y-intercept is on the midline, that's another way to tell it's a sine graph. Your y-intercept is on the midline. All right, one last example. Let's look at this guy. Again, our goal is to decide if it's a positive or negative sine graph and what A and C are. So let's look at this guy. All right, so I'm hoping you can tell he's been shifted down, right? He's been shifted down for sure. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Some points that are going to help us here, like there's our -2 is our highest point, and -8 is our lowest point. So what's in the middle between -2 and -8? I'm just going to do the math there. I'm going to average them out. -2 plus -8 divided by 2, right? If you want to average two numbers, add them together and divide by 2. So -5, that's our midpoint. That's halfway between -2 and -8. And that's where the midline is. So if the midline used to be the x-axis and now it's at -5, I can tell this whole thing got shifted down 5. Okay? And it starts at the midline on the y-axis, so I know it's a sine graph, and it's going down first, so it's going to be a negative sine graph. Right now, we know our midline is -5, so that's our C value. We know it's going to be a negative sine graph, so our A is going to have a negative in front of it. But what is the amplitude? Well, it's the different distance from -5 to -2, or from -5 to -8. That distance is 3. Okay, so here's the equation for this graph. -3, because it's a negative sine graph, 3 is the amplitude, and it got shifted down 5. So these are the thoughts that you need to have during the next few slides.